Hello guys.
My biological sister accused me of SA in front of our step-family and everyone believed her when it was all a lie. 7 years ago, my world flipped upside down. At 18, I lived in a typical chaotic blended military family. My dad, a disciplined, no-nonsense man named Mark, had remarried a strong-willed woman named Laura. Together, they ran our household like a tightly scheduled operation. There was me, my younger biological sister, Sophie, and our two stepsisters, Madison and Lily. Sophie and I weren't exactly close. We fought about the dumbest things, clothes, who got the last slice of pizza, you name it. It felt normal, just sibling rivalry stuff. So when my parents decided Sophie should live with our biological mom, I figured things would calm down. I couldn't have been more wrong. It started with a family meeting. Dad and Laura sat me down, their faces grim. Adam, Dad began in his serious military voice, "This is something we need to talk about." Laura sat beside him, arms crossed, her lips pressed tight. Then came the bombshell. Sophie had accused me of something horrifying, claiming I'd hurt her in a way I can't even bring myself to repeat here. I froze, every word punching me in the chest. I didn't do anything. I yelled, but their faces remained somber. "We believe you," Dad said, though his tone sounded flat. Then came the rules: no being alone with Madison or Lily. No closed doors. No exceptions. "We're doing this just to be safe," Laura added. Safe from what? I wondered bitterly. The worst part wasn't the accusation itself, though. It was the ripple effect. The news spread through the family like wildfire. My Aunt Rachel stopped asking me over. My cousins suddenly avoided me at gatherings. Even family friends started looking at me differently, though they never said anything outright. The only people who stood by me were my Uncle Ben and Aunt Karen, who knew Sophie well enough to suspect there was more to the story. Still, even their support couldn't undo the damage. I was left drowning in suspicion, resentment, and disbelief. And Sophie? She got to carry on like nothing had happened, while my life felt like it had just been burned to the ground. After that conversation, life at home became unbearable. Laura's strict, just to be safe, rules turned the house into a prison. My every move felt monitored. I couldn't babysit Madison or Lily, even though I had before. If I walked into a room, they were expected to leave. God forbid I closed my bedroom door. At first, I tried to hold on to the idea that my parents truly believed me, but their actions told a different story. When you believe someone, you don't make them live under constant suspicion. School wasn't much better. Rumors spread like wildfire, even though Sophie's accusations were kept within the family. I started noticing the sideways glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. It was suffocating. The worst moment came at a family reunion. I was standing by the food table when my cousin Ava, who used to laugh at my terrible jokes, looked me in the eye and muttered, "Disgusting." I wanted to scream, to tell her she didn't know anything, but the words stuck in my throat. Uncle Ben pulled me aside later. "Don't let them get to you," he said. "Sophie's always been manipulative, and some of us see that. Just give it time." But how could I wait out something that felt like it had no end? Laura and Dad tried to act normal in public, but at home, they treated me like a loaded weapon that might go off at any moment. I overheard them one night, whispering in the kitchen. "We can't risk it," Laura said. "What if he—" I didn't stick around to hear the rest. Whatever it was too much to bear. My one solace came from my Uncle Ben and Aunt Karen. They invited me over often, giving me space to vent without judgment. Ben would say, "Sometimes family isn't who you're born to, but who shows up for you." Those words stuck with me, even as I felt like my real family was slipping further away. And Sophie? She thrived in her new life with Mom. Social media posts showed her smiling, carefree, as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb in our family. The anger in me simmered. How could she do this? But I still hoped, naively, that the truth would come out. Little did I know, the storm was just beginning. 2 years dragged by, and I'd learned to survive in the shadow of Sophie's lie. My life was all about avoiding the house, working long shifts, and spending weekends at Uncle Ben's just to escape the constant judgment. I stopped trying to convince anyone of my innocence. It was easier to let their doubts sit in silence. Then one evening, out of nowhere, Sophie called. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, almost timid, as she asked if we could meet. Reluctantly, I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. The next day, we sat across from each other in a small coffee shop, a world away from the chaos she'd created. She looked uneasy, fidgeting with her hands. There wasn't any of the usual bravado, none of the sharp-edged confidence she'd always used to cut me down. What she said next shattered what little composure I'd managed to build. She admitted it. The accusations, the lies, everything had been a fabrication. Her explanation felt like a knife twisting in an old wound. "Jealousy," she said. She had been angry, feeling like I got more attention, and had lashed out in the most destructive way she could think of. Her words hit like a train. 2 years of isolation, ruined relationships, and whispers behind my back, all because of a fleeting moment of sibling resentment. She tried to apologize, her voice wavering, but it fell flat. Worse than the apology was her follow-up. She claimed she had already told Dad and Laura the truth. They wanted us to reconcile, to move past what had happened and start over. As if this could all be swept away with a simple conversation. I left the coffee shop feeling hollow. Sophie's confession hadn't brought the relief I expected. If anything, it had only reopened the wounds. Her words didn't undo the stares, the judgment, the unspoken doubts. Back at home, the fallout was immediate. Dad and Laura approached me as though the confession had solved everything. They spoke about relief, about family, and how this was a chance for us all to heal. Their tone suggested they saw Sophie's lie as just a mistake, something to be forgiven for the sake of harmony. But their efforts to downplay it only made me angrier. For 2 years, they had treated me like a ticking time bomb, and now they expected gratitude for a resolution they hadn't earned. The conversation ended with me walking out of the room. Sophie's confession had given me clarity, not closure. I realized that my family wasn't broken because of her lie, it was broken because they had let it destroy me. The confession should have been the turning point, but it wasn't. If anything, it made things worse. Sophie's lie was out in the open, but the damage lingered like smoke after a fire. Dad and Laura seemed to believe that the truth alone was enough to fix everything. They started arranging family time, suddenly eager to bring everyone together. Dinners were tense, with forced smiles and stilted conversations. Sophie acted like nothing had happened, her apologies sparse and mechanical, as if rehearsed. Dad would glance at me every so often, as though gauging my willingness to participate in their charade of normalcy. Laura, ever the pragmatist, went one step further. She ambushed me with a family meeting, claiming it was for healing. They seated me across from Sophie like we were at some kind of intervention. She stumbled through another apology, less sincere this time, and then turned the tables. Her voice wavered, but there was an edge of defiance. She spoke about how hard it had been for her since confessing, how the fallout had isolated her too. Somehow, in her mind, she was the victim of her own lies. Laura nodded along, urging me to understand her perspective. It was a surreal moment. They didn't just want me to forgive her, they wanted me to apologize for how her lies had backfired on her. The room grew quiet as I refused. I didn't yell. I didn't lash out. I simply said no. The silence was deafening, but I didn't back down. In the days that followed, I started hearing whispers again. Not the accusatory kind like before, but murmurs of disapproval aimed at me. Some family members thought I was being too stubborn, holding on to bitterness. Others avoided me entirely, exhausted by the tension. Only Uncle Ben and Aunt Karen understood. Ben pulled me aside after one particularly awkward dinner. "You don't owe her anything," he said firmly. "Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, nothing. This is your pain to deal with in your own time." It was the first thing anyone had said that made sense in months. But my parents weren't done. A few weeks later, they orchestrated a surprise meeting with Sophie. I walked into the living room to find her sitting on the couch, nervously picking at her sleeve. Dad and Laura hovered nearby, all hopeful smiles. "We thought it would help if you two talked," Laura said, her tone dripping with optimism. I turned around and left without saying a word. At that moment, I realized the futility of it all. My parents didn't want resolution, they wanted peace at any cost. And that cost was always going to be me. The failed attempts at reconciliation left me drained. Dad and Laura's insistence on forcing a resolution made it clear that they didn't care about my healing. They wanted the appearance of a happy family, even if it meant papering over the cracks with more lies. I started pulling away. I didn't make a big announcement or throw a fit, I just stopped showing up. No more family dinners. No more answering calls. When Laura texted about another healing session, I left it on read. It wasn't an easy decision. Cutting ties with your family feels unnatural, even when they've hurt you. But every interaction with them reopened old wounds. I couldn't move forward while they kept dragging me back. Uncle Ben and Aunt Karen were my lifeline. They reminded me that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up for you. Ben was blunt as always, telling me, "You're not abandoning them, Adam. You're choosing yourself." Still, the guilt lingered. I second-guessed myself constantly. Was I being too harsh? Too unforgiving? But then I'd remember the countless times they'd let Sophie's lie overshadow my truth. Their inaction had spoken louder than any apology ever could. Sophie didn't make it easy, either. She tried reaching out a few times, usually with half-hearted messages about wanting to fix things. One text stood out, though: "I know I hurt you, but you can't keep punishing me for it. I've already lost so much because of this." It was a reminder of how little she understood. In her mind, my refusal to forgive her wasn't about my pain, it was about her loss. She couldn't grasp that trust isn't something you can demand back. The family chatter picked up again. Relatives called me stubborn, selfish even. "She's your sister," one cousin said. "You can't just cut her off forever." But I could. And I did. With distance, things became clearer. My life started to feel like mine again. I poured myself into work, picked up old hobbies, and reconnected with friends I'd pushed away during the worst of it. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking around with the weight of my family's expectations on my back. The turning point came when I met someone who asked about my family. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But when I did, they didn't judge me. They simply said, "It sounds like you did what you had to do." Hearing that from someone outside my bubble was freeing. It reaffirmed what Ben and Karen had been telling me all along: walking away wasn't a failure. It was survival. With the chaos of my family fading into the background, I finally started focusing on myself. At first, it was small steps: cleaning up my apartment, applying for a promotion at work, and revisiting hobbies I'd abandoned years ago. I even started running again, something I used to love before my life fell apart. Uncle Ben became my unofficial mentor during this time. He'd call me up to go fishing or just hang out in his garage, where we'd talk about everything except my family. Those moments were a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone in trying to rebuild. "You've been through hell," he told me once, handing me a soda as we sat on his back porch. "But that means you've already survived the hardest part. Now it's about figuring out what makes you happy." What made me happy? I didn't even know anymore. But I was determined to find out. Work became a big part of that process. I threw myself into my job, taking on challenging projects and stepping up in ways I hadn't before. My boss noticed, and within a year, I was promoted. It wasn't just a raise, it was validation, proof that I could succeed without anyone else's approval. Socially, things were slower to change. My time with Sophie's accusations had made me wary of trusting people. But little by little, I let others back in. Friends who had been distant during the ordeal started reaching out again. Some apologized for believing the rumors, while others simply picked up where we'd left off. One night, over beers with a group of old college buddies, someone asked about my family. For the first time, I shared the whole story without choking on the words. Their reactions were a mix of shock and outrage, but mostly support. "You went through all that," one friend said, shaking his head. "And you're still standing. That's impressive, man." It was a strange feeling, pride, maybe. I'd spent so long surviving that I hadn't realized how far I'd come. As the months passed, I started dating again. At first, it felt daunting, like I was carrying too much baggage to let anyone in. But then I met Megan. She was kind, funny, and refreshingly straightforward. She didn't pry about my family, only listened when I chose to open up. "You're allowed to leave people behind if they're hurting you," she said one night as we sat on her couch. "Even if they're family. Especially if they're family." Her words stuck with me. Megan wasn't just a romantic partner, she became part of the support system I didn't know I needed. And Sophie? She still reached out occasionally, though her messages grew fewer and farther between. I'd glance at them, unread, before deleting them. I didn't hate her anymore, but I also didn't miss her. For the first time in years, my life felt like it belonged to me. While I was finding my footing again, my family was dealing with the fallout of Sophie's confession. It turned out, the truth didn't magically fix everything. In fact, it created more fractures than anyone expected. Sophie's admission had a ripple effect that spread beyond just me. Relatives who had rallied behind her during the accusations started pulling away. Some outright called her out for the damage she'd caused, while others quietly distanced themselves. Even Mom, her strongest defender, grew colder toward her. Sophie had been living with Mom ever since she made the accusations, but now their relationship was strained. Mom didn't say much about it, but word got back to me through family gossip. Sophie's lie had embarrassed her, too. Dad and Laura weren't spared, either. Their decision to enforce strict rules against me, despite claiming they believed I was innocent, didn't sit well with certain family members. Uncle Ben, as blunt as ever, called them out directly. "You let her lie tear your son apart," he reportedly told Dad at a family gathering. "And you did nothing to stop it." Laura apparently tried to defend their actions, claiming they were protecting the family, but the damage was done. People saw them differently now, less as the composed, responsible parents they pretended to be and more as enablers of chaos. As for Sophie, her once charismatic presence in the family began to fade. Invitations to events became fewer, and when she did show up, the atmosphere grew tense. People would smile politely but avoid lingering in conversation with her. She didn't take it well. According to Aunt Karen, Sophie complained constantly about feeling unfairly judged. She acted like her confession had absolved her of all responsibility, expecting everyone to forgive and forget. She still doesn't get it, Karen told me during one of our phone calls. You can't just undo years of harm with a half-hearted apology. Despite Sophie's growing isolation, some family members still sided with her. They blamed me for holding a grudge and accused me of dividing the family. One cousin even sent me a long-winded message about how forgiveness was the Christian thing to do. I ignored it. Over time, the family gatherings I used to dread became less of an issue. Sophie stopped showing up entirely, likely tired of the judgment. Dad and Laura tried to keep up appearances, but it was clear the family dynamic had shifted. Part of me felt vindicated watching the fallout from afar. But mostly, I felt relief. For years, I'd carried the burden of her lies alone. Now, the cracks in our family were visible to everyone. Still, I couldn't shake the thought, if they'd stood by me from the start, none of this would have happened. As the family struggled with its own dysfunction, I continued carving out a life that was finally my own. The space I'd created, both physical and emotional, gave me a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Uncle Ben's advice stuck with me: survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about building something better. And that's exactly what I set out to do. I started by embracing the idea that I didn't need anyone's permission to live my life. The years I'd spent tethered to my family's dysfunction had left me second-guessing every decision. But now, I leaned into the things I enjoyed, no matter how trivial they seemed. Running became my therapy. At first, I could barely make it down the block without gasping for air, but it didn't matter. Each mile felt like a victory, a tangible reminder of the distance I was putting between my old life and the new one I was building. Work also became a cornerstone of my independence. The promotion I'd earned wasn't just a title, it was a chance to prove to myself that I was capable. I started mentoring younger employees, finding satisfaction in helping others navigate the challenges I'd once faced. Socially, things were slower to fall into place. It wasn't easy learning to trust again after everything I'd been through. But I found comfort in smaller, more intentional connections. Friends who had stuck by me through the worst became my chosen family. Megan, in particular, brought a warmth I hadn't realized I was missing. Her no-nonsense kindness made it easy to open up, and her support felt like the antidote to years of conditional love. One evening, as we sat on her balcony watching the sun dip below the skyline, she asked a simple question: "Do you miss them?" I didn't have to ask who she meant. I missed the idea of them, I admitted. The family I thought I had. But the real thing? No. Megan nodded, not offering empty reassurances or advice. Just understanding. That's what my life had become, filled with people who understood me, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Meanwhile, I heard less and less about Sophie and my parents. Occasionally, a relative would mention something in passing, how Sophie was struggling to find work or how Dad and Laura seemed more distant at gatherings. It wasn't my problem anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't defined by what Sophie had done or how my parents had failed me. I was just Adam, a guy who'd survived the worst and come out stronger on the other side. And that was more than enough. Life was good. For the first time, I felt at peace with where I was and who I was becoming. But closure, as much as I told myself I didn't need it, still lingered in the back of my mind. One day, an email from Laura landed in my inbox. It was long, filled with the usual attempts to smooth things over. She wrote about how hard things had been for the family since Sophie's confession, how she and Dad regretted some of their decisions. "We just want to move forward as a family," she wrote, as though the past could be erased with a single email. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them. Not because I believed things would change, but because I wanted to say my piece, on my terms. We met at a quiet diner, one of those places we'd gone to as kids for weekend breakfasts. Dad and Laura sat across from me, looking older than I remembered. Time and guilt had etched lines into their faces, though I wasn't sure if it was guilt over what they'd done to me or how the family had unraveled since. They started with apologies, though they felt rehearsed. Laura spoke about wanting to make things right, about how they'd handled the situation poorly. Dad, ever stoic, added a few terse words of regret. But their apologies didn't feel complete. There was no acknowledgement of the deep distrust they had sown, no true accountability for the years I had lost. They seemed to think that showing up was enough. When they brought up Sophie, the conversation shifted. They spoke about how hard things had been for her, how she was struggling to rebuild her own life. "She misses you," Laura said softly. "We all do." I let the silence stretch before responding. "I've spent years carrying the weight of what Sophie did," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I've rebuilt my life without you, without her. And I'm happy now. I don't need this family to feel whole anymore." Laura's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't stop. "You didn't just make a mistake," I continued. "You chose not to believe me. You chose to isolate me, to protect Sophie at my expense. And now you want me to act like none of it happened. But I can't. I won't. Dad didn't say a word, his jaw tight. I stood up, dropping enough cash on the table to cover my coffee. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said as I walked away. That was the last time I saw them. On the drive home, I felt lighter. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was mine. I had said what I needed to say, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free. The final meeting with my parents wasn't the resolution they'd hoped for, but for me, it was enough. I had drawn my line in the sand, spoken my truth, and walked away. There was no dramatic closure, no tearful reunion, just the quiet realization that I no longer needed their validation. From that moment on, my life became fully my own. Work flourished. I landed a leadership role in my department, something I wouldn't have dreamed of a few years ago. My team respected me, not for who my family was or what they thought of me, but for what I brought to the table. It was refreshing to be valued without strings attached. My personal life blossomed too. Megan became a constant source of stability and joy. She didn't try to fix me, nor did she push me to reconnect with my family. Instead, she celebrated the man I was becoming. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the city lights, she asked me, "Do you ever regret how things turned out?" I thought about it for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "It's not what I wanted, but it's what I needed." That truth had taken years to accept. The pain Sophie caused, the betrayal from my parents, the isolation, I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But those experiences had shaped me. They taught me the value of self-respect, of drawing boundaries, of choosing peace over obligation. Even my extended family eventually fell into place. Those who truly cared stayed in touch, offering quiet support. Others faded away, unwilling or unable to accept my choice. I didn't chase them, and I didn't resent them. Not everyone was meant to stay. Sophie's name still came up occasionally in conversations with mutual relatives. I learned she'd moved out of Mom's house and was trying to make a fresh start. A part of me hoped she'd succeed, not for my sake, but for hers. Carrying that level of deception couldn't be easy, and perhaps she'd finally learned the cost of it. But her journey wasn't mine to worry about anymore. These days, my focus is on the life I've built. It's not perfect, but it's mine, earned through resilience and hard choices. I've found people who love me for who I am, who don't need lies or manipulation to stay in my life. If I've learned anything, it's that family isn't defined by blood or shared history. It's defined by trust, respect, and love. And sometimes, the best thing you can do is walk away from the people who refuse to give you those things. As for my old family, I wish them well from a distance. But my future belongs to the family I've chosen, and to myself.
Bye.